shut that door back there. Thank you. Thank you, Madeline, for reading the 7 principles. As many of you probably know, they have been the UUA's principles since 1985. Prior to that time, there were 6 principles. And I think in 1961, when the merger happened, there were 6 principles, later revised to 7. I personally like the 7 principles as they are, and while some are aspirational, I try to live them every day. So the question before us, do we need an 8th principle? So I had formed a committee to discuss this. And if you served on my committee, or attended any meetings, would you raise your hand? Thank you. It meant a lot. All of the people we read, just lots of material. We watched videos. We had animated discussions. And the committee was divided on whether we should pass the 8th principle or even offer it to our congregation for consideration. When I was Googling 8th principle, I discovered that Jennifer Wagley had already spoken to us about it. She did a Zoom service, and I attended that Zoom service. I had a tremendous amount of respect for her, and I went back and listened to that. I emailed local UU churches. I got responses that were very helpful. And I want to start with the history of the 8th principle. Paula Cole-Jones, the Director of Racial and Social Justice for the UUA, after working with UU congregations for 15 years, developed this. To briefly paraphrase her, she realized that a person can believe they are being a good UU by following the 7 principles without thinking or dealing with racism. A church in Philadelphia was the first to adopt in May 2017. Since then, over 200 churches across the country have voted and adopted, including many close to us. And I'm going to read the 8th principle. Journeying toward spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. It does not flow off the lips like the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And many UUs believe that our first principle covers the 8th and that we do not need to change. Others are concerned about the language, specifically actions that accountably dismantle racism. I don't know if y'all remember Catherine Vance. She is studying to be an ordained UU minister, and she is working with Bay Area on this very subject. So I wanted her opinion. She said it sends the wrong message to people of color if we do not adopt it. And I think one of the questions we should think about, if we do adopt, are we merely posting words on the wall? Are we ready to do whatever the UUA says is accountable? So for today's program, I recruited, and I'm so glad they said yes, Nellie Umball. She is representing a UU member who is a person of color who will offer why they think it should be passed. Mark Gilbert is representing a UU minister who is totally against it. Sharon Goodwin is going to be advocating that our fellowship pass the 8th principle. Hopefully afterwards we'll have time to take questions. So I am going to turn it over to Nellie.
I have one correction. The man that I'm representing is a cisgender white man. I'm representing the thoughts of Tom Close, who is a member of the Second Unitarian Church in Chicago, who started out with the UU congregation that's in Palestine, Illinois. He then was a youth advisor in Arizona and came back to Second Unitarian as a board chair. He's the founder and executive director of Crossing Borders Music and is in favor of adopting the eighth principle. He tells several anecdotes that helped him come to this decision. Several years ago, he was teaching cello in Fairfield Park, which is an economically poor Black neighborhood on the west side. It's a neighborhood that has been redlined for decades and faces the consequences of historic systemic racism and ongoing systemic racism. One day, a student's mother told him about a disturbing incident that had happened to her family recently. Their van was hit and badly damaged by a drunk driver. She told him how a white police officer came to the scene, saw the white drunk driver, saw the Black family, and decided to let the drunk driver go. No breathalyzer, no blood alcohol test. He was just free to go. But what Mr. Close remembered most was the way the mother recounted the story to him. She said she expected nothing different. This was simply her expectation of the way things were. At that moment, he said he realized that this family was not physically safe in this country because of their Blackness. If he wanted them to be safe, along with millions of other Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, then he and his fellow UU congregants had to act and speak and work to change those conditions. He cited another incident after the Black Lives Matter protest, when a young student who was usually outgoing and chipper was withdrawn. The student had seen George Floyd being murdered, and he realized that that could have been him, or one of his family members or friends. Mr. Cole again realized that people of color in the United States are not physically safe in their own bodies. He believes that people of color need to be physically safe in this country, and that upholding the eighth principle will help. Regarding those that believe we already have principles that steer us toward fighting racism, because we say all people have inherent worth and dignity, that this is only true in theory, that laws are designed for white people. In his own UU church, when Black members made suggestions for discussion, he tried to bring these ideas up to the board. For 8 months straight, he brought the same concerns up. Every month, for 8 months, they were pushed aside. He told the board, "We have a problem here. If these suggestions were brought up by white members, they would have been discussed long before 8 months passed." Regarding accountability, he said the church readily accepts accountability when it's almost any other group. If people who use wheelchairs ask for a ramp, and then they determine that the ramp was too steep and folks can't use it, no one argues and says, "No, the ramp is fine." Changes are made to the ramp. If non-parents put together a child care program for church events, and parents say the child care program doesn't really serve their needs as parents, nobody would say, "Well, that's okay." They address the needs and make changes. He believes that when we design anti-racism activities, we need to make sure that the people who are directly affected by racism say, "This is meeting our needs." He wants to see the organization work to crush this culture that says lives of people of color are not of full value. He believes that our faith compels us to do so. He paraphrased the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who said that he who accepts evil without protesting it is really cooperating with it. He believes that we are compelled by our faith to adopt the eighth principle.
All right. On the other side of the coin, And just clarifying, this was from a video presentation that we watched, digested, and tried to condense a little bit. Mine will be the longest one because I'm the only one who's taking the side against it. And I'm not doing that necessarily because that's me, that's because of the person who I'm reporting on. And his name is Reverend Craig Morrill. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago. He lived and studied in India, Singapore, Thailand, and Japan. He speaks Thai as well as Spanish and English. In Thailand, he worked with a women's rights organization centered in the world's largest red light district, where he taught English and wrote copy for the first community newspaper for that district's sex workers. He is a founding member of the Tri-Cities Interfaith Alliance in Washington State, which includes local UU and United Church of Christ churches, as well as synagogues, mosques, and Sikh Gurdwaras. His opening statement on the video was pretty eloquent, so I'm just going to read it verbatim. All Unitarian Universalists oppose bigotry and oppression in every form, even if they sometimes do so imperfectly. We reject any and all hierarchies of human beings based on physical characteristics. We reject any and all moral hierarchies based on sexual identity, national origin, language, or religious affiliation. We reject the notion that the needs of the human species justify degradation of the natural environment at the expense of other species. We revere beauty as something far deeper than physical appearance, and we celebrate freedom. We make all of this plain not through negative statements, not by taking a hostile stance, but by a covenant to affirm and promote 7 clear positive principles, namely the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, an encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience, and the use of democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, excuse me, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Look at the beautiful flow here, beginning with a bow to every human being, moving to a bow to the living web of existence, then ending in a moment of silence to consider the momentousness of what was just said and done. These principles serve as 7 guiding stars, but stars are more than points of distant light. They have heat and mass and gravity. They pull us toward themselves, while they also radiate power toward us, through us, and beyond us. Their pull and their penetration are irresistible. Why would a religious movement settle for anything less? Each of these 7 clearly meet the dictionary definition of a principle, namely, a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as the foundation for a system of belief or behavior, or for a chain of reasoning. Principles should be as close to forever and always in their scope and intent as we limited human beings can manage to put into words. They should be easy to understand, even for those who may not agree with them completely, or at all for that matter. We move in a beautiful arc from the individual to society to the cosmos and back again. An open, expanding circle that includes everyone and everything. They end at the right moment, leaving us in reverent silence within the, quote, interdependent web of all existence, unquote, of which we are. Okay. Reverend Morrill then reads the text of the eighth principle and points out that it is clearly not a principle by that definition. It is longer than the first three principles combined. He states that it's a policy or mission statement that calls for active participation in an ongoing conflict between, among, and even within persons. He astutely calls out that all of our current 7 principles deny any real or lasting basis for such a conflict, saying in effect that we are all one and our differences matter less than what connects us. He then points out that the language of the proposed 8th principle commits Unitarian Universalists to an endless war on a racism that's conceived as both an enemy without and an enemy within. As soldiers in this fight, we need discipline. The command to accountability or to accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions suggests the possibility of disciplinary measures to be enacted against those who do not or will not participate. He points out that such discipline is happening now in the recent silencing and punishment of ministers who conscientiously object to some UU principles. He sees this as unprecedented in Unitarian Universalism. Let's see. He then asks, to whom must we make such an accounting, and under threat of what sanctions, punishment, or other discipline? Who makes the determination about what racism is, or in what, where, or whom we find it? Is it each individual UU congregant? Or will there be a global panel or a local panel of judges? He uses as a point of reference the writings of Ibram X. Kendi, where Kendi proposes that we establish a national, permanently funded Department of Anti-Racism. That acronym would be DOAR, which I'm going to pronounce DOOR, just for, anyway. This would be comprised of formally trained experts on racism with no political appointees. The DOOR would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state, and federal public policies for racism or inequity, monitor those policies and public officials for expressions of racist ideas. The DOOR would be empowered with disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers and public officials who do not voluntarily change their racist policies and ideas. Reverend Morrill then asks if we'd be comfortable with such an organization within the UUA. Would most of our members be comfortable with such a permanent department within the UUA, or such a committee in their local congregations? Or perhaps it would be some sort of unelected, unimpeachable traveling racism assessor appointed by the UUA to check on our ideas and to use disciplinary tools, quote unquote, to wield over and against us when we fall short in or disagree with their assessment of our thoughts, words, and actions? What would the metrics, as in numbers, be? Are we okay with this authoritarian vision of the faith of the free? What could come next? This is also easy to imagine, especially after the many real-world examples we've seen in recent years. The most numerically accountable way to dismantle institutional oppressions would be to reduce the number of oppressor organizations and/or the number of their members. Such notions of accountable dismantling under a religious mantle have become very familiar to us since 9/11/2001. Even though I'm editorializing very little, I have to say, yes, he went there. But then he brings up the unpleasant facts about the recent actions of the new UU Ministers Association, as it has worked to destroy the careers and reputations of several ministers in recent years, removing dissenting ministers from formally welcoming pulpits, and attempts to physically destroy ministers' books. He cites a letter he received from a colleague saying, "Don't read his book, just condemn it." His next observation reminds me, a former Roman Catholic, of why I'm former. We can see in the eighth principle a vision of the children of light locked in eternal struggle with the children of darkness, one of the worst ideas that religion has to offer, if not the very worst. He wraps up that thought with, "I think we can do better. Our 7 existing principles show us how. They respond to all forms of bigotry and oppression by reaching beyond them, not by locking horns in battle." He ends his presentation by suggesting the 8th principle actually be put in the purposes statement, which, unlike the principles, is essentially our mission statement and is revised significantly more routinely, and thus can be tweaked as needed. He places it as the second to last paragraph as written, so that the final paragraph reads, "Nothing herein shall be deemed to infringe upon the individual freedom of belief, which is inherent in the Universalist and Unitarian heritages, or to conflict with any statement of purpose, covenant, or bond of union used by any society, unless such is used as a creedal test." And that is how he ended his presentation.
Hi, I'm Sharon Goodwin, and I promise this will be fairly brief. Most of us have grown up in a white supremacist society. It is what our country was built on and our laws written for, and so much of our history. Our religion has grown up in that world too. We need to understand that the traditional practices of Unitarian Universalists reflect the dominant white, male, straight, middle to upper class, and ableists who created our country and our religion. The maintenance of the white supremacy culture and anti-blackness in particular has no place within our faith and must be rooted out of our culture. Our living tradition is a faith guided by ideals, expressed through our principles. The 7 principles imply how our actions are guided. The 8th principle is a call to action. The more we learn about our deeply embedded white supremacy culture, how deeply it's embedded in our society, the more we realize that our 7 principles have not been enough. My life has become immersed in the lives of Black people, starting with my daughter, falling in love with a black man, Lewis, and marrying him. That was almost 30 years ago. When they were dating, Lewis would often ask Tasha to drive when they were going through certain areas like League City, because he knew the police would notice him driving a nice car with a pretty blonde white girl in it and be worried about her. They would stop them just to see if she was all right. He grew up in Houston, Lewis did. This was his experience with the police. Now I worry for their children, my grandchildren. I especially fear for my grandson, this wonderful, wonderful young man who just turned 18 years old. He's 5'11", and he's black. I fear for him. I ride the bus since I quit driving, and many of you know that, due to my vision issues. I also work in a predominantly black neighborhood 2 days a week with Galveston Urban Ministries. People ride the bus for many reasons. Lots of people don't have cars in the poor areas of the city. I see people that must use the bus to get groceries, managing to get on the bus with many grocery bags, getting off at their stop, and lug them all home. I don't think I could do that. But then I don't have to. But the people who do have no choice. Many people ride the bus to work, to court, to pay bills, to doctor's appointments, and so on. Some people ride the bus in the summer just to get some air conditioning. Lots of interesting people on the bus. I met a young black man one day. He was going for a job interview. He spoke perfect English. A couple of black high schoolers got on the bus. You know, Ball High doesn't do school buses for the kids. They ride the city bus. So I see them a lot. But these two kids got on the bus and they spoke to my new friend. He talked to them using all the slang we hear black kids use, and it surprised me. After everyone sat down, not close to us, I asked him why he did that. He said, well, if he doesn't, they give him a hard time saying, look at you trying to be white. He gets it from both sides. I usually sit quietly and just watch people. It took a while for the usual riders on the bus to figure out that I was okay and to speak freely. I'm not the only white person that rides the bus. I'm not saying that, but I am usually a minority. I find that it's good to be a minority sometimes. It's good for my white, privileged self. It teaches me to be grateful for what I have. White supremacy groups are going rampant in our country again and are becoming more and more violent. We see it on the news all the time now. People die in places where they should feel safe, like schools, shopping malls, churches. Adults and children die simply because of their skin color. Today is Mother's Day, and we celebrate it together. Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tara Rice, and probably many others we don't know about, are not here to celebrate with their mothers. These young people would probably still be alive today if not for the color of their skin. We all saw videos of the deaths of these young people. We were sad and often angry. Now is the time to show that anger and profess our desire to stand against such horrible actions in our country and our state. The eighth principle is a way, a beginning, a statement. I know we are not racists here. I know we stand up for what is right. The eighth principle is not a recruitment tool to get black members. I don't know if we've ever had a black member or if we ever will. This is not about that. It is time to make a commitment to stand strong against a powerful and terribly wrong ideology we have fought before, white supremacy. It was wrong before, and it is wrong now. We should get behind the eighth principle in our fellowship. We need to approve this principle and be proud to do it, because at this very scary time in our country, it is the right thing to do. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all. I know it's a lot of information, and also know when the candles burn down, it's time to wrap it up. But based on what you have heard, can I do a straw vote? It's non-binding. If you were asked today to approve the eighth principle, how many of you would say yay? I'd be happy to. Oh, it's in the bulletin, right in the middle. Yes. I agree. And maybe we should have yet another discussion about that, about the accountable part. I will say Maggie is on Zoom, and she had sent me an email that if the UA develops some sort of certificate that would indicate types of activities that would meet the requirements, we should not feel threatened, like, through programmings and stuff. But I understand. Yes, Sandra?
It's simple for me. We did trainings when we wanted to be a welcoming church. And, I think people are so not appropriate hostilities are. And it's an easy thing for us. Can't hear what
Okay. Sandra said that she thinks it would be an easy thing to do, that we have done training such as what was done with the welcoming congregation. And I haven't looked into this in depth, but there is something with the UUA called Jubilee training, which I assume is working towards this. But I think just based on, it looks like half and half in here, I think I'll ask the committee to meet again before the annual meeting, and the board can decide whether or not we bring it up for a formal vote. Does that work for everyone? But I want to thank my participants. You all did a great job.